Welcome to part 2 in my series of 3 videos about the Durer Melencolia artwork. If you haven't seen the first video, this may not make sense to you, so I'd suggest to go back and look at that. So the series part 2, so we'll start here with section 1, and in section 1 it's really about how this all began for me and how I became interested in looking at it a bit deeper. I've been following the work of Robert Edward Grant, and he'd shown how to construct this polyhedron shape. And I found that when I went back and looked at the artwork, I just began to notice things within it. When I had the idea there was more underneath the surface, and I was interested in setting it up on CAD software and seeing what geometry I could find. So I've listed 4 or 5 ideas which I began with, and in a way my feeling is this is the basic information that Durer probably intended to draw people in. So the first thing on my list is the Putto, which is this small angel here. I remember looking at the artwork and thinking, okay, what draws my attention most? And I kept coming back to this patch on the head here. It also fitted quite comfortably into this general circle of the head. I noticed later on that there were other subconscious clues which may have drawn my attention to that, which is the edge of the building, the compass which seems to point towards it, this line of this comet or star pointing towards it. Very importantly, the 2 eyes looking at it, and also this oval shape here, which seemed to project up towards it. So next we'll look at the ladder. So the ladder is generally known to be 72 degrees, or generally agreed to be that angle. So that said to me that I should be looking for a pentagram or a pentagon, and I had really no idea whether that related to any of these lines here. And it was only later that I realised that it connected to the centre of this sphere. I also could see there's some connection here. The sphere, the dog, the object, and the star. There seemed to be a line running down there, and I was interested in what angle that might be and what else it could relate to. I looked at the rainbow and I wondered what would happen if I drew a complete circle, and I really had the impression that the spheres would somehow fit into that, and there were a few different lines to work to. So I was really quite interested in seeing what happened with that. And then finally I had this conviction that nothing is wasted and that these angles were important. So I was interested in finding out what the angles were and then projecting them up and seeing where they went to. So that's the end of section 1. In section 2, I'd like to talk a bit about accuracy. I think when I began this, I assumed that because it was Durer and he was such a good artist, that everything would be immaculate. And I found that isn't the case. Everything was just slightly out, just slightly loose. I've written drawing boards as the first heading here. I began life as an architect, and in those days I was working on a drawing board. I would have found drawing small circles such as the sphere, or even working out from here, fussy and difficult. Something possibly 4 inches, 6 inches, 10 centimetres, 15 centimetres is more comfortable to draw than something much, much smaller. We also had very good equipment in those days, far better than anything Durer would have had from his time. So I would assume that he would have just laid a drawn it double the size and laid a grid over the whole lot, like this, and then just scaled it down to the final size. So it may not have mattered if something moved around slightly, as long as it was broadly within whatever grid he was using. Next, I've written irregular rectangle. I set the drawing up and I made this edge here a perfect vertical line with the computer software. That meant that this line over here, I've exaggerated here, was out slightly. So the given dimensions across here are 18.8. So is that at the bottom or at the top? Because it did seem to vary by a few millimeters, so I can't quite remember now, but there was definitely an inward slope. I would assume this could have occurred because these copper plates may have been cut with a guillotine, and that's something that can occur when that process is carried out. So that's one thing. So then if he's using a perfect grid for his master copy and then an imperfect plate, that would shuffle things around. So next we'll take the sphere. So I really began drawing the sphere as accurately as I could, and then began to put it in here. But I had a lot of trouble working out how to fit this in the rainbow. And if we zoom into the rainbow, you can see that it sort of does this. And again, with these lines here. So ultimately, I ended up working backwards. I think I may have ended up starting with this circle, taking 2, and then making those 2 fit these 3, and then placing that over the sphere down the bottom here. But I think it didn't matter to Durer. He would have never assumed that anyone would have had the level of accuracy to reverse engineer this. Another quite strong telltale sign is the A on the Melencolia and the L. And I think if you look at the part 1 video, you can see this. So if I follow the circle round, really the A tends to stick out. I think this red is a bit too fat for that, but the A is definitely too tall. But that didn't matter to Durer, but it began to affect particularly this line here. And I wasn't sure whether the line should have been on that edge or that edge. It just did seem a bit odd that it was down the middle with no real strong reference. I think towards the end of the study, my feeling was that the sphere should have been just slightly over. I think I've exaggerated it a bit there. But it made sense that the centre of the sphere lined up with the centre of the Melancholia. And then finally, the vanishing point. The centre of the circle is roughly, it would be exactly on the horizon, but if I follow this line down here, it ended up slightly below. I haven't drawn that very well, but it ends up in the water, just slightly below the horizon line. There's a slight possibility that Durer intended that, but I don't really think so. It could give a strange optical illusion, but I don't think so. I think that's just another slight inaccuracy which he wouldn't have been too worried about. So nothing quite fits. It's all just slightly loose, and that may explain some of the geometry from the part 1 video. Section 3, I'll be looking at the imagery in the artwork and giving my interpretation of that. So let's begin again with the putto and this bright patch on the head. I believe this is a reference to the pineal gland, and Durer's drawn it nicely in the centre of the circle of the head. So the pineal gland is a pinecone shaped gland located in the centre of the head. It has many different names, primarily the third eye or the seat of the soul. And it is understood to be the means by which we connect with the higher realms and the higher dimensions. So if I explain it this way, if we have us down here, then we have the angels up here, and then the Puto are a higher frequency, they're further up, and up the top we have God. So Durer is saying connect with these higher beings using the pineal gland, and later on he gives precise instructions on how to do that and tools to do that with. I just want to comment on the Puto. The Puto are they're drawn as these infant children, and they're believed not to have form in the same way that angels do have form. People believe they see them, and the wings actually are a representation of light, which can be interpreted as flowing outwards from the body of the angel, whereas the Puto are just a what I could say is a vibration, just a form of energy, but so they need to be portrayed somehow. So the artists from this period have chosen to portray them as very young children to represent purity of form. So next I'll move on and we'll look at the angel. So I find that if I read about this artwork, there's a lot of reference to this being a depressed and forlorn woman, but I don't agree with that. I see this face as something really quite attentive, and it's looking here. I'd also look at the shape of the body. This to me is a man's body. Very strong physical body. The hair is long, but long hair was in fashion for men at that time, and I think that confuses a lot of people. We've also got the legs are open, which is a masculine way of sitting, but not really very ladylike. And we'd probably also be seeing something a bit like that as well if it was a woman, but I can't see that. So I'm quite sure this is a man, and I believe it's Metatron. Metatron is the head of the angels, and further reason for that is this here, this book. Metatron is in charge of something called the Akashic Records, and the Akashic Records are the record of everything. So if you can contact Metatron, you can ask him anything. So if you'd like to know, say, when the pyramids were built and how they were built, Metatron would tell you. So let's move on and talk about the sphere to star trajectory. Which is this. So if we draw a line from the sphere up to the star, it passes through the dog, and there's also another patch on the dog here. Passes through this point, the central point on the face of the polyhedron, and then links up with the star, possibly travels beyond that. And I believe this is a reference to the dimensions, and I need to refer to Rudolf Steiner. Steiner is believed to be a Rosicrucian, and he writes extensively on this subject. And Rosicrucianism didn't officially start until about a century after Durer, but these ideas were around really going back to the Middle Ages. You could even say back to ancient Egypt and beyond that. But Steiner writes very clearly and concisely about it. And my belief is that Durer has drawn this trajectory to make reference to that. So if we start down the bottom, we have the sphere, and I think this is a reference to the first dimension of pure form. The dog is a reference to the second dimension, which is the animal and elemental kingdom. And Steiner discusses why dogs and why animals are in the second dimension. The Durahedron refers to the third dimension, which is our third dimension of form. Steiner also talks about, although we live in the third dimension, we're really fourth dimensional beings, so we need to be one dimension higher to be able to perceive the dimension below that. And I'll link to the book where he talks about this. So the stone object is in the third dimension, and then the fourth dimension is space-time. So we have the star in space, and then to the right of that we have the hourglass, which represents time. And then we could also say the ladder takes us up to the fifth dimension. Something I find interesting is that he's drawn the rainbow, and it cuts between the third and the fourth rung on the ladder. And the rainbow, I believe, is a reference to the veil, and the veil is the idea of mythology. The veil separates us from seeing higher dimensions, apart from the few very advanced spiritual people. So Durer is really talking about piercing the veil by spiritual practice, developing the pineal gland and connecting with these angels and other beings who are outside of the veil, literally, in his artwork. And then finally we'll talk about the charm and the spell. So if we go down to the bottom right corner, we see this object here. I think initially I thought this was a telescope, but we're really about 50 years too early for that. But it looks as though it could be something called a charm, which is an early reed wind instrument. And the idea of bringing sound into this makes a lot of sense, which we'll discuss later on. So if we follow the line of the charm, it connects with this here, which is a crucible. So we have this fire here. If I draw the circle of the rainbow all the way around, I have earth here, we have fire here, we have air here, and we have water here. So these are the four alchemical elements, and I think Durer is casting spells within the artwork. And there probably is a lot more to this, but it's not something I really understand very much.